Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the H&K VP9. So it's a pretty neat little gun, to be honest. Not going to go into anything particularly special about it, just talk about how to break it down. It does have a takedown block so that if the magazine is in it, you can't actually rotate the takedown lever. So that is a type of magazine safety, just not the kind we normally think about. So step one obviously is taking out the magazine. At that point you can rotate the takedown lever and slide off the frame. Has a captivated metal recoil rod, which I like. You've heard me rant about those before. Happy about them. And a flat wound spring, another thing that I like. And barrel is a standard cam lock mechanism. It does have a slightly larger diameter at the front. It locks up nice and tight. And once you look at the rest of the slide, here's where things start to get a little weird. Mine has currently the little Wonder Wings installed for gripping onto it when you rack it. If you don't like those, it comes with a set of just fillers, but you do have to remove the rear sight to swap those out. And since I don't have a sight tool on me, I'm just going to leave that be for now. But here's where things get odd. This gun has obviously it's a striker fired gun, but it has a interesting striker safety, which is this. They're part of the trigger bar. When the trigger is pulled into place, we'll actually move this aside by coming in on the outside of it and pushing it over, allowing the striker to then come all the way forward. So, nothing rocket science little there, but it is kind of interesting. So for disassembly, it's not unlike other striker-fired guns like the Glock or whatever. You need to get into where, if you see this plastic sleeve, you do need to pull that down so that you've taken the pressure off at the back. And then when you release it, the striker assembly can come all the way out. I'll take that all the way down. The firing pin safety, or striker safety here, is a little interesting. If you notice, this roll pin does not go all the way through the gun, so it's a sort of blind hole in that you can't actually get to the far side of it. So in that case, it is a blind hole. But in this case, you're actually driving out a very small pin into the actual striker chamber. So when we drive this out, we're not driving it out the far side of the gun, we're just driving it into the middle of the gun. And so once you do that, you should be able to shake the little roll pin out. Go ahead and set the place block aside for now. Now, the striker assembly at this point can be lifted right out. Basically, this is a large pin, and then this the striker itself is just on a little plate in there, and just lifts out, and there's a spring holding it all together. So I'm just going to tip these out so you can see them. Oops, spring stayed in. So what's going on there is, first of all, the pin itself, you'll notice, has a curve cut out of the side of it. That's to match the chamber, the striker chamber. So that's the inside of it. The pin just goes through and keeps it from rotating. The spring sits on it. Actually, I'm sorry. The spring is not next. Next is the actual moving plate. And this spring has one leg that's turned up a little bit, so it goes onto the shaft, and then the little leg goes into the large hole, And when it's in the gun, this leg is pressed to the side, which makes it want to rotate counterclockwise. So the trigger bar will push it clockwise, but the spring is going to return it to the position where it intrudes onto the firing pin chamber. And that's really all there is to that piece. It's not anything amazing. Go ahead and knock out the extractor while we're here. So H&K is using these multi-wound roll pins. So the roll pin is, rather than just being a sheet of metal rolled around once, it's like a coil. So you probably can't pick that up on the camera, but there's multiple layers there, all rolled around like 3 times. So once you knock the pin out, the extractor itself comes right out, and the extractor spring actually has a plastic stiffener in it. So as well as a fairly hefty spring, it has a piece of fairly tough rubber in there that helps add tension. The extractor is nothing crazy special, except it does have one thing that I like, which is this pad is raised, so that controls how far in the striker can go. And a lot of times, a lot of guns have that area raised because it's an adjustment. You can take off 1/1000th of an inch there if you need to bring your extractor in a little bit. But this one left space on the top and bottom, and that actually lets fouling basically accumulate around it without actually necessarily getting in there. So this little square piece will kind of keep pushing the fouling away because it has spaces on all sides of it to go. That means that the extractor keeps a consistent tension for much longer as the gun gets more and more fouled. At the bottom edge is relieved a little bit to help it catch, to help it come up over rounds coming out of the magazine. If that edge wasn't cut like that, they would tend to stub right in and cut into the brass. And it's got fairly substantial claw there, comes in a good bit, and a loaded chamber indicator, which just means that since the extractor will be pushed out by the round, that you'll see that. And that's pretty much all that's fit to tell about the extractor. And that's all the parts inside. Let's go ahead and break down the striker assembly. As always, to do this, you have to put something under this. If you're really strong, you can just use your thumb and push against it. But we're going to compress the spring, and if we don't have something supporting the end of the striker, it's just going to go down, and we need the spring to come down so that we can pull these big spring cups away from the firing, or from the striker. So again, that's just a matter of using something to hold the striker at the top while we compress the spring. And notice this is a monstrous striker spring. As well as that, if we now take the striker out, you'll notice that there's also a striker return spring, and that's there to basically make sure that after the gun fires, that we don't want to leave the firing pin protruding while it's chambering. So we want it to pull back so that after it makes a strike, it doesn't stay protruding during cycling, so that you don't get any strikes on the next round until you're actually ready. The spring cups are not anything that unique. They're just a lot taller than, say, Glock ones, which is kind of nice because they're a pain in the butt to hang on to. These ones are a little easier, which is helpful because you also have to use a lot more pressure to compress that gigantic spring. Now, you don't have to have the striker itself doesn't have any kind of cuts milled into it for the safety, because the safety truly does block it right on the sear surface. Or actually, I guess technically it's this little notch here that this comes into, so it doesn't actually Alright, let me change that. I lied. If it were technically grabbing the sear, it would be grabbing the flat part, which would cause it to wear out over time. But because they've milled out a little diagonal cut here, basically that's what this actually dips into and blocks, which is smart. And then this as well is a cocked indicator. You can see the tail of the striker when the sear's holding it back. You can see it poking out the back. So you see a little indicator that it's definitely cocked or not without having to wonder. And that's pretty much it. There's not that much else to tell about this. So I'm going to go ahead and put it all back together. Don't forget the return spring in there. And again, now we have to compress the crap out of this. And as always with spring cups, try to avoid try to avoid putting the spring cups, the seam between the two spring cups, right where the end of the spring is. It's best to have the end of the coil spring in the middle of a single spring cup, not right in the edge. That it's not a huge issue with a spring this hefty. Probably not an issue at all, to be honest. Okay, I guess we can pop the extractor back in. Make sure you have the little insert in there. You don't want to lose that. Extractor won't work nearly as well. Alright, now that it's started and caught in the hole, I was just holding the extractor in with finger pressure until it lined up. And once I know it's lined up, then I drive it the rest of the way in. And we want to make sure that this is ever so slightly past flush. We don't want it, way past, or it'll stick out here. You don't want it sticking out the top, and you don't want it sticking out the bottom. So it will be just past flush on both sides. The firing pin, the striker safety goes in next. And to be honest, I wish there was a better trick to this than I've found so far, because every time I go to do this, I tend to struggle to keep it all lined up, and I'm not 100% sure why. So I had the brilliant idea yesterday that if I lined the whole thing up first and then grabbed it with a hobby knife, that maybe I could keep it together or completely fail. So remember, the important parts here are that the large pin, the recessed cut side that matches the striker channel, has to go on the inside, and the protruding bit of the spring has to come up into a little hole. And I got most of that in there. Now once you get it partially in, this leg of the spring isn't going to be in the right spot, so you have to make sure that you come over and get it there. And now this takes a little finagling, because the spring kind of wants to fight you a bit here with getting try and make sure that the spring is still in position everywhere. Get that pin the rest of the way in. And basically right now the reason my pin's not all the way in is I think I'm caught on the edge of the spring somewhere. Yeah. There we go. So basically what I was doing, I'm still not sure that's 100% of the way in. Looks real close. Let's see if I'm lined up with the hole here. Oh, I think I am. Beauty. So once I had it most of the way in, basically I just went in underneath where I could just barely poke at the spring, so I probably can't catch it on camera, but if you get right in under there, I just kind of wiggled it around till I could get it to drop down the rest of the way. And then it is helpful to go in there with a punch to make sure that that is aligned with the hole for the roll pin. And again, I'm hanging onto it with my finger so it doesn't drift around. And the roll pin has a little recess that's slightly larger than the roll pin, which is helpful to get it started, because you can get it in just about enough to catch the edge of the pin. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't think I am quite lined up. Yes, my pin is not quite all the way down. Nuts. Nuts and butts. I might have to get this guy out and try again. May have gotten myself into an interesting position if I've tapped that roll pin just far enough in to catch the edge of this, but not enough. If this is not as far down as it needs to be, could be in a little bit of trouble. Let's see if we can give this a gentle tap to see if it'll just go past its spring. Don't want to hit it too hard because we'll mangle said spring. Maybe I'm just being a little bit of a wuss on the roll pin. Let's try that again. And that's all it was. I was just being a little bit of a wuss. Alright, lesson learned. Probably wasn't quite 100% lined up left-right wise, and once I got it lined up, roll pin went in, and again, to get this guy on, we're just going to grab a hefty punch to push and hold plastic in as we slide that guy right up in there. Now we should be able to check everything. We should be able to bring the striker back with a lot of pressure. It should not come forward because it bumps into the safety, and when the safety moves out, now the firing pin can come all the way forward where we see it protruding. So that is the upper. Making a video. And there's a cutout in the slide. Making a video. So there's a cutout in the slide for the curve to sit, and so pop that in there. It'll stay nice and solid. So that is the upper. Now, frame. Frame is interesting. The trigger itself is a lock for the takedown, and so in order to remove the takedown lever, we do have to pull the trigger. Otherwise, the trigger basically is sticking up into this big slot underneath it. And so that's one out. And there's a couple other strange things as we go through this. This piece here is a little bit of an oddball because it's a just debating when's the best time to deal with that. I'm sorry, got distracted. So, where's my little punch? The next thing you want to do is take this plastic piece out. That's what's retaining the right side of the slide stop. And you just put on the ground in there and pull up. It's got a little clip, and that's all it is, a little plastic clip. And that's what's holding this side in. So now as you pull this out, the spring itself will release, so put a finger over it so it doesn't launch. But you should be able to pull it all the way out of the gun. And that little, recess there is where the pin was sitting. So that's how that holds itself in. And now we can kind of shake the trigger spring right out. So this piece is what we want to get at next, and it can be a little tricky when the gun is new. Once it breaks in, it's not so bad, but basically you don't push it in, you have to get behind it from the inside and push it out. And so that generally means you've got to get some leverage and kind of peek in there. And sometimes it's a little hard to do. First one I ever had to work on, this piece came out really easy, and this one, don't know if it's just because it's new or what, but it's been a pain in the butt. It's just really not wanted to move. Every time this happens, I convince myself that there must be another mechanism that I'm forgetting about that's somehow holding that in place. But to my knowledge, there's not. So it's just a matter of getting behind it and getting it to move. Sorry if this is coming off camera a bit. Why must it do this to me? Pop. There it goes. Alright, so once I got under it, got a good push on it, got it moving. Of course, it didn't come all the way out, which is annoying. Just need to keep levering it out until it does pop out. There we go. And that's that piece. So obviously you can see why you don't want to drive it in, because the inner shank is significantly smaller than the outer shank. Now I'm going to warn you about a couple things before we go any further. There's a tiny spring right here that is the slide lock spring, and it's just a coil spring, and it's being held in place by the locking block itself. So once we drive that roll pin out and remove the locking block, that spring is going to want to launch on us. So hang on to that. And also there's multiple pieces over here. There's actually one of them, I think it's this one, the disconnector can probably actually slide out now if we're really careful. That's what this far right piece of metal is. And it's the disconnector because basically when this gets pushed down, there's a little ledge on this that also gets pushed down, so it pushes the trigger bar down with it. We'll see all that once we get it apart. But let's go ahead and drive out that roll pin. Oops, let's not break the lights. So there's two different ways to approach this roll pin. Basically, it actually is an alligator pin with a small roll pin on the inside. So you can either get a small roll pin punch and drive the inner roll pin out first, or you can just drive the whole thing out as an assembly. It's probably slightly better for it if you actually take the inner one out first, but either way. So there is the coil spring I was talking about, and over here I'm grabbing this piece with my finger because between the locking block and this piece is a very tiny spring. This is the magazine takedown safety thing. So if the magazine is in, notice that this rotates into that big circle, which is where the takedown lever goes and would prevent the takedown lever from operating. But it's a very small spring in here, so be careful not to launch it. So basically this piece is mostly flat. It just has this one bent up piece and then the piece that interacts with the magazine. This little piece here is actually what catches on the spring. So the spring sits in there like that, and then that piece comes up. That little tiny piece is going to help bring that leg up and into the recess. So when you're putting the whole thing together, once you get it started, yeah, you're doing that. And so that's how you, when you get to put it back in, that's what we're going to end up doing. So anyway, for now, just hang on to both bits. The other thing about the locking block, this piece, something I don't like about it is that it's a welded piece, and that primarily bugs me because of how they also built that pin that you have to push out, which means you're pushing apart on, you're putting stress on those welds, but hopefully not too much and not for long periods of time. And at this point, the slide lock will come out. The trigger bar itself, you may have to push in the little flipper leg, but the trigger bar will come out. Now, I went ahead and did not disconnect my spring first. So your spring may be, and yes, this is a crazy ass spring. So a word about the spring. The spring goes in from the outside, and it is not just a semicircle. You can't come up from the bottom. If you do, you'll damage it. You want to come in from the outside. That's so it doesn't drop down to the inside. So if your spring is staying nice and taut in your frame, as you lift the trigger bar up, you want to basically pop it away from the spring so the spring can stay in the frame. If yours comes out easily like mine, what you'll notice is that it just drops into a very small hole right there. It's right about in this, about 75% of the way back on the mag well, and it really fits fairly easily in there. So and once you actually line the trigger bar up again, it doesn't come out. So don't bend it is the key thing. Don't put any extra stress on it. Let it keep its crazy shape, otherwise you'll be buying a new one. This one was a little bit interesting. This little metal block I found curious. That's the corresponding piece that the trigger, the center trigger safety the flipper, as I like to call it, that's what it interacts with. And I'm not sure why they decided to make it out of metal, but basically it bumps into that block until you lift it up, and so that block sits right in there. I would not disassemble this any further if you don't have to. I mean, you can. It's not rocket science to do it. It's just it's all polymer. It's a little bit on the fragile side. If you notice that they didn't drill this hole all the way through, so this nice large looking roll pin over here looks much smaller over here. If you pushed it out that way, you would actually make a much larger hole in it, and that would be bad. Likewise with the other roll pin, which is really tiny, which is in there. You know, no real reason to remove that if you're not replacing trigger components themselves. I just prefer to keep these in one piece. So that's all the bits out of the front. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not quite all of them. I lied. There's one other spring. This guy right here. This is, what is this? This is the spring tension for the locking lever itself. Once we get that all the way in place, notice this little spring moves in and out so that it snaps and stays snapped. That's the entire purpose in life. It either lies in this section or this section. That's really all there is to it. So if you did want to take it out to give it a complete cleaning, it's just a big U-shaped thing, and when you go to put it back in, same thing. The little bent leg is towards the front of the gun, and just tuck it all the way down in there when you're done. Okay, so roll pin to get to the meaty bits. You know, I didn't actually talk about the function while we had it back there, because this is pretty damn weird. There's two pieces here. This piece here, this large piece with this notch, that's the actual piece that catches the sear. So the striker is caught on this piece. Now there's two pieces here. There's this piece and this piece. They're actually two different pieces of metal once we get in there, but they're engaged with each other pretty interestingly. The trigger bar actually pushes on this one, and it's really weird because it has to be perfectly aligned with it, and it has to go down at the same rate that it goes down. If the trigger bar comes straight back, it would pop over the top. If it came down too fast, it would pop underneath. The point is, though, if you pull this one back, this one goes down. Now, the reason I believe that they did this is because when this one moves back and down, trying to do this so that everybody can see it at the same time. Hopefully this is more or less visible. As this one goes down, this one is coming straight down pretty fast. So almost as much downward movement as this has rearward movement. So it really is a pretty good way to translate, you know, the lateral movement as you're pulling the trigger with the vertical movement required to drop the sear. What that means is this is a true single action firearm. In the Glock, when you pull the trigger, you're actually moving the striker back. You have to pull the striker back with you, and as you're going back, the whole thing goes down. This one's not like that. This one, you are simply bringing the sear out of contact with the striker. So the Glock is technically a double action pistol, even though it doesn't have a true second strike capability like hammer fire double action guns do. But this one is different. This one is truly just moving this piece down. So all the energy of you pulling the trigger backwards is being translated into downward force. to disengage the here. And then the disconnect just where's my trigger bar? So wondering, let's see, what could I could probably put this in there well enough to demonstrate that, maybe. So yeah, the trigger comes back and it pushes just like that. Whoops. I'm holding it, the trigger in place, obviously. Normally the springs would keep it at the right height. And so you see that the trigger, it's not a huge pusher surface, but it does push very accurately. I will demonstrate it when it's reassembled. But the other thing I was going to say is after the strike, after when the disconnect happens, what happens is that this bar pushes this bar down. So this bar gets bumped on the top, and it's the trigger bar itself has this little ledge right here. So they sit essentially together. Go ahead and put them both in so we can see it all at once. So if I try and hold the trigger bar up, I'm going to act like we've pulled the trigger. Oops, now I've overridden it. That's no good. I've pulled the trigger. And what's going to happen is as the frame cycles, the disconnector gets pushed, which brings this down with it. And the reason is because of how they sit together. So this little ledge of the trigger bar gets caught, and when this pushes down, it forces the rest of it down with it. So anyway, what to do? Let's go ahead and get the guts out because it is pretty cool. Where did my big roll pin punch go? This roll pin here holds the rear of it together, and this one is just an alligator roll pin without the reinforcing bar. So once that's out, this little piece of it, this is a little metal piece that locks into the back of the frame. So to get the thing out, the whole thing comes basically ever so slightly forward until that's disengaged, and then the whole thing can lift out. And that's it. There's no more bits in the frame. So it's just levered in there and then pinned in through the bottom. I'm going to set the frame aside for now. Actually, before we go into the guts, which are very cool, let's take a quick detour to the magazine release, just because it's pretty straightforward. And so let's just get it out of the way so I don't forget it later. Again, a single roll pin holds the thing together. And once you take that out, hang on to it because there is a spring involved. You'll basically be able to lift this in towards the inside of the trigger guard, and notice there's a big old hole there and a big old spring that actually goes in the hole. And so that's how the whole thing works. Everything else is just pushing against the frame. This spring just sits in a recess in the frame, and this is the mag catch. So when you push these guys down, this gets brought forward and the magazine is no longer caught. Otherwise, it's sitting in there. So this little flipper is what hangs onto it. So there's a little metal insert into the polymer rest of the gizmo. Now putting it back in, if you do it upside down, you may find it to be slightly easier. I also can't remember if you can actually do this the way I'm doing it. No, you actually have to. I lied. Ignore that. We have to get the spring dropped in there first, essentially, and then we're going to have to line the spring up with the little hole as we go with the rest of it, because otherwise you don't have room to get the whole thing in there. So once you get it essentially started partially in there, you'll get to a point where you can wiggle this, and it'll go in only when the spring is gone into the body of it. So it just kind of snaps in. So you just wiggle it until the spring pops into place. Now you don't have to really overcome a whole lot of force to line it up for the roll pin. And the way I recommend doing it is basically these little ears will lock into place, and either the top will be out of place or the ears will be out of place. And if the ears are locked there, then you really only have to manipulate the top of it to get it to line up. But it is kind of a lot of eyeballing to get this started again. And so gentle taps to get it going till it's in place. And I think I drove it all the way out the far side. Yeah. And test it, make sure it's happy. You can see it doing its thing on the inside. All right, now we can actually set the frame aside and get into the cool bits. This is fairly novel to me in how they put it all together. So you have a polymer insert again in a stamped steel frame. So this is steel stamping similar to the stainless steel front stamping, except this one's blued. Looks to be almost exactly the same thickness. Probably is exactly the same thickness. Probably actually the same metal now that I think about it. I'm not sure why they... Well, I don't know. Maybe this one's a little harder. I don't know. Who knows? I'm no metallurgist. I will admit that freely. So the ejector and the rails are all built into this big stamped structure. And everything else is a polymer insert, which is holding the other bits. So to get the insert out, again, one pin, and it's these little wings of polymer that intermesh with the steel on the front that aligns it. So again, the polymer piece goes in, and then a single pin holding it together. So I think it's once again with the big old roll punch. It's the same large roll punch every time. It would help if I picked up the large roll punch every time. You saw where I put it. I didn't see where I put it. Okay. So we're gonna drive this bad boy out. Got a little rubber in my roll pin. All right. So now that the pin is out, we're going to just have to move it forward to get it past its little steel enclosure. Gets a little smaller each time. So as long as we don't lose any parts now, everything is still working, and we can start to see a little bit about what's going on here. And so you have the piece that the trigger actually engages with is one piece of metal, and it hooks. Use this as a pointer. So this is the trigger engages here, and this piece has a little hook that goes in the way of the actual sear piece, and then there's a big coil spring pushing the actual sear back up. So just a bunch of different ways to do this, and I'm not sure why they built all of them. Like, if we put this back together for just a second and wonder together, if I'm not mistaken, nothing actually can operate this leg, but they built a leg there. It's almost like they were at some point thinking about, making the trigger work differently so that it would, come up underneath this and have the same effect, but they didn't, because this piece is basically going to be bottomed out in the frame. So why that leg is there, who knows? Maybe the piece was just easier to make that way. Anyway, the other thing that they did here is that you have 2 pins that are holding everything together, and again, they only go out and in one way. So you can push through the hole and get the little silver rod out, but the silver piece could not go in from this side. It's too small. So everything only goes in one way. Same is true for the other one. That piece gets pushed out only from this side. Now the other thing is that because of how they're hooked together, it's really hard to get one out without taking them both out. I poked around with it the other day and didn't come up with anything, so basically I'm going to relieve a little bit of the spring tension just to make this slightly easier. But again, once the large pin comes out, you gotta hang on to it there, because you've got a pretty substantial spring underneath it. Now they're both free to come out, essentially. And so this one has got the spring pretty well attached to it, and then this one we can finagle our way out. And again, all this piece from here forward, I have no idea why all that's there. Or maybe it was just easier to manufacture for whatever reason. Maybe these things are stamped out of the same thing, although this one's got a big piece here, which means maybe it's cast that way. Who knows? But again, if we want to look at how these guys actually engage in the gun, so this piece fits right inside there. So as this piece is being pushed down, now remember they have 2 different points that they rotate around. So the sear rotates at a much further distance than this one. So this one's going to tip and bring the other one down. So that actually is changing the mechanical advantage as well. So it takes a different amount of force to push this down than if these had, if they were pinned at the same point, they would truly be pushing the same way. Anyway, all that aside, you can remove this spring if you have some burning desire to. I don't recommend it. You want to make sure it gets back on there if you do, but you can take it off. Remember, twist in the direction that would open the coils when you're taking a spring on or off of a stud like that, and it'll make your life easier. If you twist it in the direction of tightening the coils, obviously you're just making things worse for yourself. So, again, this is another gun with these super small pieces that have got to be really, really hard to be this small and not wear out. And I think that that's a harbinger of the new metallurgy process that's coming down the road of the metallic glasses, where things are forged and then, cast. Very small pieces can be cast and then quenched in liquid nitrogen in such a way that they cool insanely fast, and you end up with something that is unlike just about any other steel out there in terms of its hardness, but it doesn't shatter, it doesn't get brittle like most hard steel. The harder steel is, the more brittle it is as a general rule, but there's something out there that they have now that defies said generality. So anyway, tucking it back in is pretty straightforward. you get the two pieces interlocked and you get them started at the front, and then again we're going to compress that spring and get the back piece lined up. Get this here and then drop in. Oh, fumble fingers. Drop in this guy. And you can push him all the way in because it's going to bottom out in that blind hole. And then this guy is going to flop around until we line him up as well. And get him going. And again, these you don't hammer these in or anything. They're just sitting in there. And once they're in there, they interact together and do their thing. So kind of cool. I mean, simple, sort of. I mean, simple to see, not so simple to actually come up with the design. So kudos to the kids at H&K. So putting it back together, again, I just slid the polymer piece in and it engages there. And so polymer surrounded by steel on this side, steel surrounded by polymer on the other side. And once it's all the way tucked in there, then we can drive our roll pin back in. Again, you want these to be just past flush. You don't want them protruding out either side. So, as best you can, center them, but don't overdo it. Beauty. So, once that's back together, getting it in the frame is pretty straightforward. This little ventral fin goes into this slot, and remember that this piece has to get tucked into the back, so as you're putting it in, you'll kind of do both those at once. Again, you're really getting it mostly at the right depth and then sliding it back into place. The roll pin that doesn't have, it's the shorter alligator roll pin here. Oops, I gotta get a better angle to do this. Same principle here, make sure it's not center it as best you can. All right, reassembly of the rest of the guys. The trigger bar and its spring. Let's try it. Let's put the spring in first and see if we can't get the trigger bar to sink into it. Fail. By the way, do your best to keep this spring clean. Coil springs, while having some amazing properties that make them really useful, if they get grit between the coils, they will tear themselves to pieces, and they're no good to anybody when that happens. So I went ahead and aligned. Let's do that again so you can see what I actually did. So remember that we have to come in and get this spring in from the side. It can't just come up underneath. So before we're lining it up. We've got to get it in there, make sure that we haven't pulled the whole thing out, and then we can get the whole thing, you know, seated in there temporarily. Can go ahead and drop this in there now. Whoops, actually, this little leg does go under a ledge in there, so you kind of have to tuck the backside in first, and then you got to do a couple different things at the same time, which makes this mildly tricky. So first we're gonna get this guy in there. Now it has a long leg and the short leg. The short leg is the top, and again, this piece is going to sit, I'm holding it upside down at the moment, but the idea is that that catches the spring and pops in there. So the whole spring is in the little well that's milled out in the side of the locking block, and the magazine disassembly disconnect is the black piece, and that little ridge that's holding the spring is also completely inside that little well. And the other things that we have to have in there, where did it go? I don't know. Here it is. Is our left side slide lock and the little dinky spring. That little spring, by the way, sits in that little cutout, and the reason this has got a cross shape is because that's how it gears in with the far side piece with the same cross shape. So all that, so that piece tucks in there, at which point this little guy just sits straight in there for now, and trying to hold all this in place at once. If we're lucky, we should be able to just slide everybody in at the same time. So while this guy was a pain in the butt on disassembly, for assembly he's a little bit of a godsend, because once he's in there, once he's in there, those other pieces, the spring and the locking block won't be able to go anywhere, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure why my words are failing me. Don't wail on that. Just get it back into place. And everything else now we can line up with the help of just a little punch to go through and get a good sense of everything being where it needs to be. And we're going to start this guy back in until we get him just into the trigger guard there. Sorry, till it grabs the polymer leg of the trigger. And now we need to get our spring in there. And to be honest, I totally just forgot which way the long leg goes and which way the short leg goes. I'm pretty sure the long leg is forward. We're going to figure that out in a second, so if I'm wrong, don't yell at me. Don't have to comment. We'll figure it out momentarily. This is a very handy tool. I highly recommend it. Was it HK that sold me this? I think it actually was HK. Basically, it's a pair of pliers with a tip ground with a little round thing for holding on to cylindrical objects, notably springs. So this way you can grab a spring with a pair of pliers and actually push it into place in places where you actually have to, compress a leg of the spring, and you don't mangle the spring and you don't mangle your fingers. And I think I'm wrong. I'm going to try that with a short leg forward. No, I was right. I'll flip it around 4 or 5 more times before the end of the video. We'll get it right eventually. So basically, one leg of the spring sits right here because you can see the little gouge in the plastic, and the other leg has to be behind the trigger because it's, you know, the return force for the trigger. So you kind of have to just get all this in there at once, and that's why this funky pliers helps a lot, is because it lets you compress the one spring as you're getting everything lined up. Not even close. Thank God I don't take myself seriously. Yeah, that would have given us a very light trigger pull, but not actually a working one. I think the long leg is the back. I just wasn't getting it far enough back. Let's make sure our trigger is all the way forward to help us in this endeavor. And we're going in one more time. Alright, so this time Mr. Spring is gonna get in there and wow, I was right the first time. I just am a crappy shot. Oh my God. I am so sorry, kids at home. The long leg definitely goes towards the front. So, one more time, I'm going to line everybody up. I'm going to get pin started. Draw it back so we're just inside the polymer of the trigger. And it'd be nice if the legs were significantly longer, but and now I can tell it's right for several reasons. One is, once this pin is all the way in and engaged in the far side, meaning its little crucifix has made it into the plus-shaped hole on the far side. It's all the way in. That means it's horizontally, vertically. It's perfectly aligned with where it's going to stay in the gun. The little divot that this leg made is at the right length. When I had the short leg in, it was barely holding onto the polymer, and as soon as I pulled the trigger, it would have popped right off. And more importantly, the other leg is back, pushing forward on the trigger bar, which is what I had missed the very first time I tried it. So, actually, while we're here, I'm going to go ahead. This piece locks in. Make sure that the right side is all the way in, and that should snap right down. And the last piece is our roll pin here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to drive out the middle pin if I can. Let's see if this will work. And that should make driving in the alligator one much easier. Make sure that the locking block is all the way in so that you don't have extra resistance. Wah! And I just totally lunged at the camera. Alright, sorry about that. Let's quick adjust. Sorry. Alright, hopefully that's close enough. Alright. now we'll just drive in a little roll pin into the middle of this bad boy, most of which should go in fairly smoothly, and get the right size one so I don't completely mangle it. And again, that inner roll pin is now stretching out the alligator one just a little bit so that the alligator one isn't going to drift anywhere, which means I really should have centered it better first time. As long as it's beyond flush, everything's good. Okay, so operationally, let's take a look at everything we got going on here. So okay, so what's going on first, as the trigger comes back, notice that the middle leg, I'm only pushing on the right side of the trigger. So the middle leg suddenly is sticking further out. So that keeps you from bumping into it. That means when you put your finger on the trigger at first, it's really easy to get there. But if you're not centered, the more off you are, the worse it gets. And that means that if the trigger is being pulled really hard and you try to push the middle leg, it's got resistance, because the middle leg is actually going to cause the whole trigger to come forward. So if I pull the outside of the trigger, if I pull the main trigger body back as far as I can, and if you watch as I push in the leg, watch that the trigger itself is going to actually come ever so slightly forward. Not a lot, but if you watch like the plastic, right, the polymer right as it meets the trigger, you'll see that it comes out just a little bit before it disengages and goes back. So anyway, that's kind of a cool mechanism. I think that's why the metal piece is there, is to arrange for that to work like that, so that you can't override this. If your finger is really not on it, no amount of force, the more you push on this, the harder you're going to just engage that safety until you actually push on the middle of it, at which point it's very easy to come off. Now, back here, notice the interesting path that this whole thing takes. So as you're pulling it, it goes up and it begins to come down, and then it kind of lines up and it comes straight back. So all of that craziness is just designed to get it so that it's hitting the top of that piece, and then as it pulls back, it moves to the bottom. So it's going to catch this right at the top, on the top of the trigger bar, but because this piece is going to go down as the trigger bar comes straight back, trigger bar moves more or less straight back. As this piece comes down, it's moving from the top of the trigger bar to the bottom of the underside of the trigger bar. So while this is just the distance of the stamped piece, it's not a whole lot of meat there, it's enough to engage that reliably every time. And like I said before, when the gun cycles, the disconnector is this piece, and it's going to pull down the rest of it so that it goes under, allowing everything to snap forward. That gives us a relatively short reset to right there. So, oh, the other piece here, this angled surface here on the trigger bar, this is what moves the firing pin safety out of the way. It's it's right on the edge, and it comes right up and scooches that guy towards the inside as it comes by. So right towards the back of the pole, pretty much at about the same time this engages, this has just now begun to open that safety up, and once it's at this point on the inside at the flat part, that's all the way in the aligned position. So if this trigger is not pulled and something causes this to release the sear, this will not be disengaging that firing pin safety. So that's why it works. I keep saying firing pin safety, you know I mean striker safety. What else is there about this gun? I think we covered all the interesting bits. Seems to have most of its parts back together. Oh, yes. Let's put this back in. You can actually see a little better now how the trigger prevents this from coming in or out. If I tried to put this in, I will run into this metal leg of the trigger. That's why it's made of metal, is so you don't just break it off like you would if it were polymer, yanking the thing apart. So in order for this to work, you do have to pull the trigger, at which point this goes in nice and easy. And if you just put gentle pressure in as you rotate it all the way down, it'll snap past that other big U-shaped spring, which gives you that stiff takedown. So remember, don't try and pull this out without pulling the trigger down, because it's not going to come out. Once the trigger's out, now you can get the whole thing to pop right out. So that piece down, line everybody back up, and lock it to the back, snap it up, unlock. And so we have cocked indicator, goes away when we fire it, rack it, we can see it again, fairly short reset, and bang. And so that is the H&K VP9. Nice little gun, in my opinion. Goes with my H&K Armorer's block. Hope you had fun. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.